The sun was just beginning to set over the city, casting long shadows on the streets as people hurried home after a busy day. In the midst of the rush, there was a man standing at the corner of a bustling avenue. His clothes were old, his shoes worn, and his face showed signs of a long life filled with struggles. His name was Daniel, but to most people he was just another face in the crowd, someone who didn't fit in, someone who was often ignored even when he was in plain sight. Daniel wasn't asking for much. He wasn't asking for a handout, nor was he looking for sympathy. He was simply hungry. His stomach growled loudly as he stood near a small restaurant, hoping someone might spare him a meal. He could feel the weight of the day on his shoulders, each step heavier than the last. The world had always seemed too big, too overwhelming. He had never been able to make much of an impression, despite his dreams of one day sharing his music with the world. Music had always been Daniel's refuge. It was something he could rely on, something that never failed him. Ever since he was young, Daniel had felt a deep connection to the piano. The keys seemed to speak to him in a way words never could. He had spent hours, sometimes days, playing melodies, composing little tunes of his own. Music was his escape from a reality that often felt too harsh to bear. But life had a way of getting in the way of dreams. Daniel's love for music was never fully realized. There was no time for lessons, no money for a piano. As he grew older, his situation worsened. He found himself in and out of various odd jobs, never quite able to make ends meet. His passion for music was pushed aside as he struggled to survive. But deep down, he knew the music was still there, waiting to be shared with the world. One afternoon, as he wandered the streets, he passed a fancy restaurant. The windows were large, allowing anyone passing by to see the elegant interior, the well-dressed patrons enjoying their meals, and the soft notes of piano music drifting out. Daniel stopped for a moment, captivated by the sound. He had always loved the piano, and the thought of playing it again stirred something deep inside him. He watched for a while, feeling the ache of longing. What would it be like, he wondered, to sit at that piano and play for people, to share the music he had kept inside for so long? It was then that he had an idea. A bold one, but one that felt right. He knew it might sound strange, but he had nothing to lose. With a quiet resolve, he walked to the door of the restaurant and hesitated for a moment before pushing it open. Inside, the sound of the piano was even clearer. The air was filled with the scent of fresh food, and the clink of silverware echoed in the background. Daniel's heart raced as he approached the hostess stand. The woman behind the desk looked up at him, her expression cold and slightly disinterested. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone formal, as though she had dealt with many people like Daniel before. He could already sense the judgment in her eyes, but he wasn't deterred. I was wondering if I could play your piano," Daniel asked, his voice quiet but steady. He knew it sounded like an odd request. He wasn't dressed for the occasion, and he certainly didn't belong in this upscale restaurant. But he had asked, and that was all he could do. The hostess raised an eyebrow, a slight smirk forming on her lips as she glanced at him. "You want to play the piano?" she repeated, clearly unsure if she had heard him correctly. "Yes," Daniel said. I'd really like to play." For a moment there was silence. The hostess stared at him, and Daniel felt a wave of self-doubt wash over him. What had he been thinking? Why would they let him play? But before he could back down, the hostess sighed and motioned toward the grand piano in the corner of the room. "Fine," she said dismissively. "You can play. But don't expect anyone to care." Daniel nodded, thankful for the chance, but the words stung. He wasn't asking for attention. He just wanted to play. He moved toward the piano, his heart pounding. His hands were slightly trembling as he sat down on the bench, the cool keys before him seeming almost foreign after so many years of not playing. But once his fingers touched the keys, everything else faded away. The music was still there, and it filled the space in a way that words never could. The restaurant's patrons, who had been chatting among themselves, turned their attention toward him. Most of them eyed him with curiosity, some with open skepticism. A few snickered to themselves, exchanging glances and whispering under their breath. Daniel knew they were thinking the same thing. What could a man like him possibly have to offer? He began to play. At first the melody was soft, almost hesitant. He played the first few notes of a song he had composed long ago, a piece that had always been close to his heart. It was a simple tune, but to him it meant everything. His fingers danced across the keys, feeling the rhythm and the emotions that poured from the music. The sound grew louder and more confident, and as he played, something magical began to happen. The room fell silent. People who had been whispering stopped, their eyes fixed on the man at the piano. Some of them began to recognize the music, while others were simply captivated by the raw emotion that seemed to seep from every note. The restaurant, which had been filled with chatter and laughter, now seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the next note. Daniel's music spoke louder than any words could. His fingers moved with precision, each note carrying a weight of emotion, of longing, of dreams that had been put on hold for too long. It wasn't about impressing anyone. It was about expressing everything he had kept inside, and as the music filled the room, something inside of him started to heal. The hunger in his stomach, the weariness in his bones, all of it faded into the background. There was only the music. The hostess, who had originally dismissed him, stood frozen by the doorway. Her expression had changed from disinterest to something else entirely. Surprise, maybe even admiration. The other staff members, who had been busy with their tasks, now stopped and turned their attention to the piano. The murmurs and laughter that had been present earlier were gone, replaced by the beauty of the music. Daniel kept playing, unaware of the growing crowd around him. He wasn't performing for anyone. He was simply playing what he had always wanted to share with the world. The music was his gift, his way of speaking when words failed him. And in that moment, it was enough. He didn't need applause, he didn't need recognition. The only thing that mattered was that for the first time in a long while, he felt truly seen. As Daniel continued to play, the atmosphere in the room slowly began to change. At first, the soft hum of conversations mixed with the sound of the piano. But soon enough, it was as if the entire restaurant had been transformed. The murmurs of the diners began to fade, and people leaned forward in their seats, drawn in by the melody. Even the clinking of silverware seemed to stop, as if the world was pausing to listen. Daniel didn't notice the change at first. His focus was entirely on the piano. His hands moved fluidly over the keys, each note flowing effortlessly into the next. The music was familiar to him, but it felt new in the way he played it. It was as though the emotions he had kept locked away for so long were finally being freed. Each note was an expression of everything he had experienced, his struggles, his dreams, his longing for connection. The music seemed to speak to the hearts of those who were listening. Some patrons sat in silence, transfixed by the beauty of the melody, while others were moved to tears. It wasn't the technical perfection of his playing that affected them. It was the raw emotion and vulnerability that poured from his fingertips. He wasn't just playing notes. He was telling a story, one that everyone could understand, no matter where they came from. As Daniel played, he noticed something unusual. The once dismissive looks from the staff and the diners had softened. The hostess, who had initially scoffed at his request, stood by the entrance with her arms crossed, but now she looked at him with a mixture of awe and respect. She had probably never expected to witness something like this. Daniel wasn't just a man asking for food. He was a gifted musician who had been ignored for far too long. The sound of the piano filled every corner of the restaurant, wrapping around each person like a blanket. Even those who had been skeptical of him when he first walked in now found themselves captivated by the depth of the music. It wasn't just a piano performance. It was a moment of profound connection, one that broke through all the barriers of class, appearance, and judgment. One of the diners, a middle-aged man in a suit who had been eyeing Daniel with a mixture of amusement and condescension, sat up straighter in his chair. His expression shifted from one of indifference to one of genuine interest. He exchanged a glance with his companion, who was equally absorbed in the music. For a moment, they forgot about their dinner and the mundane worries of the world outside. It was as though they were hearing something they hadn't known they had been missing. Daniel's fingers danced lightly over the keys and the melody shifted. It was a familiar song, one that he had written years ago. The notes, though simple, held a deep personal meaning for him. It was a piece about loss and hope, about finding light in the darkness. The music expressed feelings he had never been able to put into words. It had always been his way of coping, his way of making sense of the world. The room was completely silent now. Not a single person spoke or moved, as if everyone was holding their breath, waiting for the next note. It was as if time itself had slowed down, and all that mattered was the sound of the piano. One of the waiters, A young man who had been refilling water glasses earlier now stood frozen at the back of the room. His eyes were fixed on the piano, and he seemed to have forgotten the task he had been assigned. The music had completely absorbed him. He felt as though the notes were telling him a story, one that resonated with something deep inside him. It was a strange feeling, one he hadn't expected to experience in a place like this. For the first time in a long while, he felt something stirring within him. He wasn't just hearing a song, he was feeling it. The emotions that had been locked away in his own heart seemed to unlock with every note. The music was reaching him in a way nothing else had for a long time. It was as though the piano had unlocked a hidden door in his soul, and he was experiencing something he hadn't even known he was missing. As the song reached its crescendo, Daniel's playing became more intense. His fingers flew over the keys, each movement filled with energy and passion. It was clear that he was pouring his heart into the music, leaving nothing behind. He was no longer just playing for the people in the room. He was playing for himself. It was his way of finally expressing everything he had kept inside for so long. The music built to a powerful climax before gradually slowing, the last few notes trailing off into silence. The sound hung in the air for a few moments, and then, almost as if on cue, the entire room erupted into applause. Daniel blinked, his fingers pausing above the keys. He hadn't expected this. The sudden outburst of applause was overwhelming, and for a moment he felt like he was in a dream. His hands trembled slightly as he looked around, his eyes meeting the gazes of the diners who were clapping and cheering. Some people were standing, others were wiping their eyes. He had never seen so many people moved by his music before. The hostess, who had been watching him from the entrance, was now smiling at him. Her arms, which had been crossed in a defensive stance earlier, were now relaxed at her sides. She looked at him with a sense of admiration, as if she had just witnessed something extraordinary. For a moment, Daniel felt a mixture of embarrassment and pride. He had never been the center of attention like this before. He had always kept to the background, content to play in private, away from the judgment of others. But now, in this moment, he realized that he had touched something deep inside the people who had been listening. His music had reached them in a way that words never could. As the applause began to die down, Daniel stood up from the piano. He was still a little stunned by the reaction, but he couldn't help but feel a sense of warmth spreading through him. He had done it. He had shared his music with the world, and it had been received in a way he had never expected. The diners slowly returned to their meals, but the atmosphere in the room had changed. The tension had lifted, replaced by a sense of quiet reflection. People were talking in hushed voices, exchanging thoughts about the performance they had just witnessed. Some were asking each other about the man who had played, trying to understand who he was and where he had come from. Daniel stood off to the side of the piano, unsure of what to do next. The applause had died down, but he wasn't ready to leave. He didn't want to leave. This was the first time in so long that he felt like he had done something meaningful. He wasn't just the hungry man asking for a meal. He was the musician who had touched people's hearts. A waiter approached him and gave him a small smile. "That was incredible," he said, his voice sincere. "I don't think anyone expected that." Daniel simply nodded, too overwhelmed to speak. He had never been one for words, especially when it came to his music. He had always let the piano do the talking for him. "Thank you," Daniel said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. The waiter smiled again, nodding. "You're welcome. We've got a few people here who are curious about you. They want to know more about you." Daniel glanced around the room, unsure of how to react. He had never been the subject of such attention, and it made him feel both nervous and proud at the same time. But for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel invisible. He didn't feel like just another person on the street, overlooked and ignored. In that moment, he felt seen. He felt valued. As the evening continued, Daniel remained standing near the piano, unsure of what to do next. The applause had long since faded, but the echoes of the performance lingered in the air. For the first time in years, he felt like he wasn't invisible. He had always been the quiet man in the corner of the world, unnoticed and overlooked. But tonight he had been heard. Tonight, his music had found an audience, and for that he was deeply grateful. The waiter, who had spoken to him earlier, came up to him once more. This time his expression was softer, almost respectful. You know, the waiter said quietly, there's a gentleman over there who wants to speak to you. He's the one who owns the place. The man gestured toward a well-dressed man sitting at a corner table, his eyes still fixed on Daniel. He's been watching you since you started playing. Daniel's heart skipped a beat. The owner of the restaurant? He wasn't sure what to make of this. He had never expected the attention of someone so important. His initial instinct was to refuse, to shrink back and disappear as he always had. But tonight was different. The music had changed something in him. He had taken a step forward, and he didn't want to take a step back now. Thank you, Daniel said, his voice quiet but firm. He took a deep breath, then slowly walked toward the man who had requested his performance. His steps felt heavier than usual, but there was a sense of purpose behind them. For once, he wasn't walking to avoid attention. He was walking to face it. As he approached the table, the man looked up from his glass of wine, his eyes narrowing as if trying to place him. Then a smile slowly spread across the man's face. He stood up, extending his hand to Daniel. That was incredible, he said, his voice warm and inviting. I didn't expect that. We don't get performances like that often around here. Daniel hesitated for a moment before shaking the man's hand. Thank you, he said simply, his throat tightening. It wasn't just the compliment that moved him. It was the fact that someone who had every reason to dismiss him, had taken the time to acknowledge his gift. I'm the owner of this restaurant, the man continued, his tone friendly but professional. I've been running this place for years, and I've seen all sorts of musicians come and go. But what you played, that was something special. I can tell you've been through a lot. Daniel wasn't sure how to respond to that. He had always kept his past hidden, buried beneath the surface of his music. No one knew what he had been through, what kind of life he had led before he found the piano. It was his refuge, his escape, but this man in just a few words had somehow sensed it. Daniel started, then stopped himself. He didn't know how to explain it. How could he put his entire life into words? How could he explain the years of struggle, the loneliness, the quiet desperation that had driven him to the piano in the first place? It was too much for him to say, but the man didn't press him. Instead, he smiled and nodded. You don't have to explain yourself, he said gently. I understand. Music speaks louder than words ever can. Daniel was taken aback. For once, someone understood. It was a rare feeling, one that he hadn't experienced in a long time. I just play because it's the only way I know how to express myself, he said quietly. The man nodded again, his expression thoughtful. Well, I'd like to offer you something. How would you feel about performing here regularly? You've got a real talent, and I think the people here would love to hear you play more often. The words hung in the air for a moment, and Daniel couldn't quite believe what he was hearing. A regular performance? In a restaurant like this? He had never imagined that something like this could happen for him. He had always seen himself as the outsider, the one who played for himself, never daring to dream that others would appreciate his music. I don't know, Daniel said, his voice unsure. I'm not sure I could. I've never really done anything like that before. The man smiled, a kind, understanding smile. I'm not asking for a commitment. I just want to give you the opportunity. I think you have something special, and I'd like to see you share it with the world. He paused, his expression softening. You don't have to decide now. Just think about it. Daniel stood there for a moment, his mind racing. Could he really do it? Could he play for others in front of an audience regularly? The thought terrified him. The idea of exposing himself, of letting people into his world, was something he had always avoided. But the music had been his refuge for so long, and now, here was an opportunity to share that gift. Thank you, Daniel said finally, his voice filled with gratitude. I'll think about it. The man smiled again and nodded. Take your time. Just know that the offer stands. As Daniel walked away from the table, he felt a strange mix of emotions. The fear was still there, the fear of rejection, of failure, but there was also something new. Hope. For the first time in years, he felt like he had an opportunity to do something bigger than himself. The chance to share his music with the world, to step out of the shadows and into the light, was something he had never thought possible. He walked back to the piano, his mind still swirling with the conversation he had just had. The restaurant had returned to its usual hum, but it felt different now. The staff moved about, carrying on with their duties, but Daniel felt like he had been given a glimpse into a new life. He wasn't just the hungry man asking for food anymore. He was a musician, and his music had touched people. That was something he could never have imagined just a few hours ago. As he sat back down at the piano, he ran his fingers over the keys once more. The sound was familiar, comforting. For a moment he closed his eyes and let the music fill him again. It was the only thing he truly understood, the only thing that had never failed him, and now maybe it could give him something more. Daniel didn't sleep well that night. The thought of performing in front of a crowd, week after week, lingered in his mind like a heavy weight. What if they didn't like him? What if he failed? His hands trembled as he lay in bed, replaying the conversation with the restaurant owner over and over in his head. He had never imagined that his music, the thing he did alone in the quiet corners of his life, could be shared with the world. But there was a small part of him that felt different now. Something had changed and he couldn't ignore it. The offer to perform regularly had given him a glimpse of something more than just survival. It was a chance to thrive, to be seen and heard, even if it was just for a few moments at a time. He had always kept to the shadows. He didn't want to be seen because he feared rejection. His music had been the only part of his life that no one could touch. But now someone had noticed him. Someone had recognized his talent and had given him the chance to share it. That was a gift, and he knew he couldn't let fear stand in his way. The next day, Daniel decided to visit the restaurant again. He wasn't sure if he was ready to make a decision, but he needed to see the place again to get a feel for it. The idea of performing there still made his heart race, but the thought of walking away without even trying seemed worse. As he stepped into the restaurant, the familiar warmth of the place surrounded him. The sounds of clinking glasses, soft chatter, and laughter filled the air. People sat at tables enjoying their meals, unaware of the man who had been changed by this very space. Daniel walked slowly to the piano, his eyes scanning the room. He noticed a few regulars, the ones who had seen him play the night before. They greeted him with polite nods and smiles, but it was clear they didn't know his name. They didn't know his story. He was just the man who played for food, the quiet figure in the corner. But now Daniel saw the piano differently. It wasn't just an instrument. It was his bridge to a new life. It was the thing that had already changed him, and maybe, just maybe, it could change others too. He sat down at the piano, his fingers hovering over the keys. The last time he played here, he had been nervous, unsure of himself. But today, something felt different. There was a sense of purpose in his movements. He wasn't playing for food anymore. He was playing for something more, something that only he could define. A few minutes passed before the waiter who had spoken to him before came over. "Hey, are you okay?" the waiter asked, his voice soft and concerned. "I saw you come in, but you haven't played yet. Are you thinking about what we talked about?" Daniel nodded, though he wasn't sure how to answer. "I don't know if I'm ready," he said quietly. "I've never done something like this before. What if I'm not good enough? What if they don't like me?" The waiter smiled gently. "You're already good enough. You played last night and you moved people. You can do this. Just trust yourself." Daniel looked at the piano, the keys gleaming softly under the dim light. He took a deep breath and nodded. "I'll think about it," he said, more to himself than to the waiter. The waiter patted him on the shoulder and walked away, giving him the space he needed to think. As the minutes passed, Daniel found himself lost in the music again. He ran his fingers over the keys, testing the sounds, allowing the familiar chords to comfort him. The piano had always been a safe space, a place where he could be himself without the fear of judgment. But now there was a new weight to the music, a weight that came with the possibility of sharing it with others. He thought about the people in the restaurant, the ones who had laughed at him the night before. He thought about the owner's offer and the way he had looked at him with such kindness and respect. Could he really step up and take that chance? A soft tap on his shoulder brought him out of his thoughts. He turned to see the owner standing there, a warm smile on his face. "Hey, I'm glad to see you back," the owner said, his tone friendly. "I just wanted to check in with you. Have you thought about our offer? I really believe you've got something special." Daniel swallowed hard. "I'm still not sure," he admitted. "It's a big step for me. I don't know if I can handle it." The owner nodded, understanding in his eyes. "I get it. It's a big commitment, but I know you can do it. And remember, it's not about being perfect. It's about sharing something real. Your music speaks for itself." Daniel felt a surge of emotion as the words sank in. He had always been afraid of not being perfect, of failing in front of others. But the owner was right. Music wasn't about perfection. It was about expression. It was about being real. "I'll do it," Daniel said finally, his voice steady. "I'll perform here." The owner's face lit up. "That's great. You won't regret it, I promise." He placed a hand on Daniel's shoulder and gave it a gentle squeeze. "I'll make sure everything's set up for you. You just come in whenever you're ready." For the first time in a long time, Daniel felt a sense of excitement bubbling inside him. He wasn't sure where this new path would lead, but he knew it was the right one. It was time to stop hiding, time to stop being afraid of what might happen. He had music inside him, and it was time to let it out. As the owner walked away, Daniel sat at the piano again, his fingers hovering over the keys. He played a few soft notes, testing the feel of the instrument beneath his fingertips. This time the music didn't feel like an escape. It felt like a beginning. He didn't know exactly how things would unfold, but for the first time in years he felt like he was stepping into something bigger than himself. It was no longer about playing for food or playing in the shadows. It was about playing for something that mattered, playing for himself and for everyone who needed to hear the music. The night of his first performance finally arrived. The restaurant was buzzing with activity, the air thick with laughter and conversation. The soft clinking of glasses and the murmur of guests blended with the sound of clattering plates from the kitchen. Yet amidst all the noise, Daniel felt a wave of calm as he approached the piano. It had been a few days since he had agreed to perform, and his nerves were still there, but they were quieter now. The constant echo of doubts that had once consumed him had faded into the background. There was still a twinge of uncertainty, of course, but now the uncertainty felt more like a challenge, a call to embrace what was about to happen. As he sat down at the piano, he noticed the familiar faces from earlier in the week. The waitstaff, the regular diners, people who had seen him before even if they didn't know his name. They weren't expecting anything extraordinary. They were just here to eat, to relax. But Daniel knew something they didn't. He wasn't just here to fill space with music. He was here to prove to himself that he could stand in front of them, not as the hungry man asking for a meal, but as an artist with something to offer. The restaurant owner approached him with a smile, offering a quick nod of encouragement. "You've got this," the owner said before returning to his duties, leaving Daniel alone with the piano. For a moment, Daniel's fingers hovered over the keys. The dim lighting made everything feel softer, less intimidating. He took a deep breath, his hands finding the first notes of a piece he had played countless times alone in his room. As the music filled the air, the nerves seemed to melt away. There was nothing to prove to anyone except himself. He didn't need applause or recognition. He just needed to play. As the first few notes of the melody began, the restaurant fell into a curious silence. Conversations quieted, heads turned, and eyes watched the man at the piano. For the first time in a long while, Daniel wasn't just another face in the crowd. He was the one drawing attention, not because he was different or out of place, but because he was playing something that resonated deeply with those listening. The melody swirled through the room, soft and elegant, and as it progressed, something remarkable happened. People who had been chatting quietly or eating their meals suddenly paused. The rich, delicate sound of the piano seemed to pull them in. The once loud restaurant became quieter, as if the music held everyone in a trance. Daniel didn't look up from the keys. His focus was entirely on the piano, on the music he was creating. He lost himself in it, just as he had done so many times before when playing alone. But now he wasn't alone. There were people listening. People who just moments ago hadn't given him a second glance. As the song came to an end, the room was still. A moment of silence hung in the air, and for the briefest of seconds, Daniel felt like the weight of the world was on his shoulders. His heart raced. Had they liked it? Was it enough? Then, from somewhere near the back of the room, a soft clap echoed. It was hesitant at first, as if unsure whether the applause was deserved. But it grew. Slowly, others joined in. At first, just a few. Then more, until the entire room was clapping, the sound of their hands coming together in appreciation. Daniel's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't expected applause, but here it was, loud and clear. It wasn't just the sound of hands clapping. It was the sound of people recognizing something important. It was the sound of acceptance, And for the first time, Daniel felt like he was more than just a man asking for food. He was an artist, and this was his stage. The owner, who had been watching from the side, gave him an approving nod. "See, I told you," the owner said, his voice thick with pride. "You've got something special." Daniel couldn't help but smile. The applause felt like a distant echo now. The only thing that mattered was the music, the connection he had made with these strangers. They had heard him. They had listened. And for the first time, he didn't feel invisible. As the night wore on, Daniel played a few more pieces. The crowd remained engaged, listening attentively to each note he played. Some diners even stopped mid-meal to take in the music. A few families with young children watched from their tables, captivated by the melodies that filled the space. Daniel's hands moved with more confidence now. His fingers danced across the keys, drawing out emotions from within that he had never shared before. It wasn't just the music that spoke. It was the vulnerability behind it, the way the music reflected his own journey, the struggle, the doubt, and finally, the courage to stand up and show the world who he really was. By the time the night came to a close, Daniel had performed for nearly 2 hours. He was tired but fulfilled. As he stood up from the piano, the applause started again, louder this time. Some diners even stood up to give him a standing ovation. The owner clapped the loudest, his face beaming with pride. Daniel stood there, a little stunned, not knowing how to respond. He hadn't expected this. He had simply wanted to share a part of himself, and in doing so, he had connected with a room full of strangers. As he walked to the back to pack up his things, the owner approached him. "You were incredible," the owner said. "I knew you had it in you. You're going to be great here." Daniel nodded, his heart swelling with a sense of pride. "Thank you," he said softly. "This was more than I ever thought I could do." The owner smiled and clapped him on the back. "This is just the beginning, my friend." Walking out into the cool night air, Daniel felt a sense of freedom he had never experienced before. He had faced his fear, taken the leap, and it had paid off. The applause had been unexpected, but it wasn't what he was chasing. What mattered was that he had shared his music, his soul, with the world, and the world had listened. For the first time, Daniel understood something important. It wasn't about being perfect. It wasn't about impressing anyone. It was about being true to himself, about embracing his talent and letting it shine, no matter how imperfectly. And as he walked home that night, he couldn't help but smile. The future was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was exactly where he needed to be. The next few weeks brought new challenges for Daniel. While the success of his performance had been a high point, he knew it didn't mean the end of his struggle. The applause had been loud, but the reality of his life hadn't changed. He was still a man with little money and a lot of uncertainty. His heart ached with the thought of how many people like him had dreams that were often out of reach. But this time something had shifted. He wasn't just waiting for things to change anymore. He had taken control, even if it was just for one night. The restaurant owner, seeing the potential in him, asked if Daniel could come back for another performance. This time he would be paid. The offer was modest, but it didn't matter. For Daniel, the opportunity was a sign. It was a chance to prove to himself that he wasn't a one-time wonder. It was time to take the next step, no matter how small. He practiced for hours each day, perfecting his pieces and learning new ones. The music became a way for him to escape, a safe place where he could pour his heart into every note. The keys were his refuge from the world. As he practiced, the doubts began to creep back in like old ghosts trying to haunt him. What if the audience didn't care? What if they were just humoring him? Could he really make this his life? But every time those thoughts entered his mind, he remembered the sound of applause. He remembered the way the music had connected with people. He remembered the feeling of validation, the recognition that he had something valuable to share. And that was enough to keep going. Daniel's second performance was scheduled for a Friday evening. He arrived at the restaurant early, making his way to the piano, which was now set up in the corner of the dining room. The staff were bustling about, preparing for the dinner rush. The air was thick with the scent of freshly baked bread and sizzling food. Daniel sat down at the piano, his fingers lightly touching the keys. The familiar weight of uncertainty settled in, but this time, he wasn't as afraid of it. As the first diners started to trickle in, Daniel began to play. The music filled the air, soft at first, before gradually growing in intensity. The guests, still settling into their meals, began to take notice. Some looked up from their plates, Others stopped their conversations. The sound of the piano was a thread weaving through the room, pulling people's attention toward it. The same thing happened as before. The conversations faded, the laughter quieted, and for a brief moment everyone was still. Everyone was listening. Daniel continued to play, his confidence building with each note. His hands moved more fluidly now, less tentative, more certain. There was something magical about this moment. It wasn't about impressing anyone. It wasn't about proving anything to anyone else. It was about him and the music, a conversation between the two that felt as natural as breathing. At one table near the front, a couple exchanged looks. They were regulars at the restaurant, known for their high expectations and discerning tastes. As they listened, the woman leaned closer to her partner and whispered something to him. He nodded in response, a slight smile on his face. Across the room, a group of friends who had been chatting loudly fell into silence. One of them turned to look at the piano, his eyebrows raised in surprise. He hadn't expected much. The music from a piano in a small restaurant wasn't anything new. But there was something about the way Daniel played, something that made it different from the usual background noise. As the night wore on, the energy in the room shifted. Guests who had been casually eating or talking were now focused entirely on the music. Conversations had slowed down, replaced by the quiet murmur of appreciation. Some even took a moment to stop and listen, leaning back in their chairs with a peaceful look on their faces. Daniel lost track of time. The hours seemed to melt away as he played. The music flowed through him like a river, each note carrying him further into his own world. The piano became an extension of himself, and the sound of it felt like home. When the evening came to a close, Daniel stood up from the piano, feeling a sense of satisfaction that was almost foreign to him. The applause came once again, soft at first, but then growing in intensity. It wasn't just polite clapping. It was genuine recognition. The guests were clapping not just because he was playing, but because they had experienced something special. They had been moved. The owner approached him, a proud smile on his face. "You did it again," the owner said, clapping Daniel on the back. "You're a natural." Daniel smiled, feeling a warmth spread through him. "Thank you," he said, his voice quiet but sincere. "I'm glad you like it." As the night wound down and the last of the guests filtered out, the owner came over to him once more. "I think we can do something bigger with you. Maybe a regular spot here once or twice a week. What do you think?" Daniel's heart leapt at the thought. A regular spot? It was an opportunity beyond anything he had imagined. It wasn't just a one-time gig. It was a chance to build something, to become part of this community in a way that felt real. "I'd love that," Daniel said, his voice full of conviction. "I really would." The owner nodded, satisfied. "Great, I'll work out the details. You're going places, Daniel." As Daniel gathered his things to leave, he couldn't help but smile. The night had been everything he had hoped for and more. Not only had he performed well, but he had also received something priceless: validation. It was the kind of validation that didn't come from anyone else's approval, but from within. He had done it. He had stepped out of the shadows of doubt and fear, and he had shown the world who he really was. Walking out into the cool night air, Daniel felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. There were still challenges ahead. There would always be challenges. But for the first time, he knew that he was capable of facing them. He was no longer just the hungry man asking for a meal. He was an artist, with a gift to share with the world, and that, he realized, was more than enough. The weeks that followed Daniel's second performance were a whirlwind of change. His life, once filled with uncertainty and silence, was now alive with opportunity. The restaurant owner had kept his promise, offering Daniel a regular spot. Twice a week, Daniel would sit at the piano, and the familiar sounds of his music would fill the room. The once small performances turned into evenings of eager anticipation. Guests now came specifically to hear Daniel play. Some brought friends, while others made reservations in advance, knowing the music would be an integral part of their night out. Daniel couldn't believe how quickly things were moving. He had gone from begging for food, asking for the chance to play, to now having a regular gig that was becoming the highlight of the restaurant. Every week more people came, drawn not just by the food but by the music. The power of a few simple notes had changed his life in ways he had never imagined, but the pressure was also building. With each performance, Daniel knew he had to keep getting better, to push himself further and to never let the audience down. His music, once a form of self-expression, was now a performance. He wasn't just playing for himself anymore. He was playing for the people who came to see him. The stakes felt higher now, and though he enjoyed the attention, there was a new level of responsibility that came with it. One evening, after his set, Daniel sat down in the back of the restaurant, his fingers gently massaging the sides of his neck. The lights from the kitchen flickered in the distance, and the sound of dishes clinking echoed in the air. It was quieter now, the restaurant nearly empty as the last of the diners filtered out. The owner walked by and saw Daniel sitting there, looking tired. He smiled kindly and made his way over. "You did great tonight," the owner said, taking a seat beside him. "You've got them hooked." Daniel didn't reply immediately. He let out a long breath, staring at the floor. "It feels like a lot sometimes," he admitted. The owner nodded, understanding. "I get it. But you've got something special, Daniel. It's not just about playing the notes. It's about how you connect with the people who hear them." Daniel didn't respond to that right away. He wasn't sure what to say. He had never really thought about it that way. He had always played for himself to escape his thoughts, his fears, his doubts. But now his music was reaching others. It was touching them, moving them, in ways he hadn't fully grasped until that moment. "I'm just worried," Daniel said quietly, almost to himself. "What if it's not enough? What if I run out of music? What if they stop coming?" The owner smiled warmly and placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "There's always more music inside you, and as long as you keep playing from the heart, they'll keep coming." Daniel appreciated the words, though doubt still lingered in his mind. He was afraid of losing the connection, of one day standing at the piano and hearing nothing but silence. But for now he pushed those thoughts away. The night had been too good, too fulfilling to let his worries take over. He thanked the owner for the encouragement and stood up to leave. The next few days were a blur of practice and reflection. Daniel would return to his small apartment, rehearse the pieces he had been working on, and then sleep. There were moments when he thought about his past, about his struggles with hunger, about the people who had looked at him with pity, and about the nights when he had fallen asleep with an empty stomach. But those thoughts seemed distant now, replaced by the gentle hum of the piano keys and the warmth of the audience's applause. As the weeks turned into months, Daniel began to form a routine. The restaurant was now a second home. His music had become a bridge that connected him to the world. It wasn't just about the food or the drink. It was about the shared experience of sitting together, listening to something beautiful and for a few moments forgetting everything else. Daniel had become more than a piano player. He had become a storyteller. One evening, a couple approached him after his set. They had been sitting near the front, enjoying the music, and their eyes were filled with admiration. The man with a gentle smile spoke first. "That was amazing," he said. "You have an incredible gift." Daniel smiled shyly, grateful but embarrassed. "Thank you. I just love playing." The woman beside him nodded. "It's rare to hear someone play with such emotion. You're not just playing the piano, you're speaking through it." Daniel was surprised by the compliment. He had never thought about his music as a form of communication. He had always seen it as an escape, a way to lose himself in the sound. But now, hearing it from someone else's perspective, it made him realize something. His music wasn't just for him anymore. It was for them, for everyone who came to listen, to feel, to connect. The couple lingered for a moment longer, discussing their favorite pieces before they made their way to the door. But the words stuck with Daniel long after they had gone. He had always wanted to be heard, to be noticed, to matter. And for the first time in his life, he realized he had finally found a way to do that. Not by speaking, but by playing. The following week, the restaurant owner called Daniel into his office. He sat at his desk, looking over a few papers before looking up with a smile. "I've been talking to a few people," he said, "and I think we can take this to the next level." Daniel's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" The owner leaned forward, his eyes sparkling with excitement. "We're thinking about expanding. Maybe even a bigger venue for your performances. More exposure. More people." Daniel was stunned. A bigger venue? More exposure? He had always dreamed of playing to larger crowds, but he hadn't expected it to come so soon. He had only just begun to find his rhythm, and now, the prospect of playing to even more people made his stomach twist with nerves. But as he sat there, listening to the owner outline the plan, Something inside him stirred. This was his moment. This was the opportunity he had been waiting for. And despite the nerves, despite the fear of stepping into the unknown, Daniel knew that he couldn't let it slip away. "I'll do it," he said, his voice steady. The owner grinned. "I knew you would." And so Daniel's journey continued. What had started as a simple request for a meal, a plea for the chance to play, had turned into something far greater than he could have ever imagined. The music that had once been his escape was now his purpose. And with each note, each performance, Daniel was finding himself not just as a musician, but as a person. He was no longer the hungry man asking for a chance. He was a man with a story to tell, and a gift that could change the world.